President Trump delivers his State of the Union address.
Joining us now, Stephen Goggin, Associate Professor of Political Science at San Diego State. Stephen, good morning.
Good morning.
Longest on record, longest State of the Union on record. What was your big takeaway?
So it's a good question. You know, State of the Unions are really kind of interesting phenomena because they're really often a focal point, right? As we know when they are, right, they're a chance for the president to make his case to the American people or to the chamber in front of him about his priorities for the coming year. And surprisingly, you know, in that, right, extremely long speech, the longest one on record, right, surpassing last year's, there really wasn't all that much new, right? There was a lot of ground covered in terms of the various policies, primarily focusing domestic. But in fact, if you'd been following the news for the past few months, you didn't really hear anything in that speech probably that will change the dynamic before now in November with the midterm elections.
A lot of it actually stuff that we expected, a lot of focus on the economy. What was your take on all that?
So it's a good question. You know, on the economy, it's one of the kind of the issues that Trump is polling the worst on in recent history, particularly given cost of living and and people's concerns about wages and inflation in the past year. And so State of the Unions are often a place where a president can make a big pivot, right? Propose a package of new things or other stuff to the chamber and try to urge its passing to address places where they might feel that weakness in their polling numbers. And a lot of what we heard last night was not particularly new either, right? It was many of the same issues, kind of pivoting between saying everything in America is great, right, and kind of giving a very rosy picture, but then also, you know, blaming Democrats for everything that was not great, right, in the chamber there. And so particularly on the economy, you know, a lot of time was devoted to that, given kind of it is the focal point of many Americans. But in fact, right, in terms of people looking for solutions or change or things that Congress could act and do and pass through the chamber, there's really not much there.
Let's talk a little bit about what he addressed as far as foreign policy goes. What could be new was what he had mentioned. He spent a few moments talking about Russia, talking about Iran, the military buildup there. What was your takeaway from that? Because he, as much as he's been going back and forth and saying he wants to have a deal with Iran, he did say yesterday that he will not allow the #1 sponsor in terror to have a nuclear weapon. So what does that mean?
So it's a good question. You know, historically, State of the Union's focused more primarily on domestic policy than foreign policy. But there have been particular instances where in most or the bulk of a speech, right, has been devoted to talking about the U.S.'s place in the world. Now, right, thinking a couple decades ago in the lead up to the Iraq War and other places where the president can make, right, a long case to the American people about the need for the U.S.'s presence in a particular part of the world or for a particular cause. And what we saw last night was relatively abbreviated versions of that, you know, mentioning things that are relatively uncontroversial that got applause from Democrats as well about, right, the need to restrain Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, something that has been kind of the standard policy of administrations, both Democratic and Republican. The question, of course, is, right, everyone's looking and seeing a massive military buildup in the Middle East and what that means or the timeline for that. You know, there was a chance to offer specifics. Of course, you don't want to reveal your hand, and really, right, there was more time spent on a lot of other things than that policy.
I want to talk to you about unity versus divisiveness. Trump spent a lot of time attacking the Democrats last night, guilting them to standing up here or there, saying shame on you, even at one point a couple of jabs at the Supreme Court, which is normally just something that is off limits in these kinds of speeches. But anything different that you took from the speech last night and from the president's comments towards the Democrats, towards the unity, if ever we can get back to that place?
Sure. You know, this speech is often a weird one because it's a little bit unknown who the audience is for.
Sure.
You know, some presidents have approached it more as like, you know, the members of the House and Senate before them making the case about why they should do things, or other presidents have used it, right, for the case to the American people, right, of trying to rally public support for these things. And if we're honest, right, the speech last night, right, contained a lot of things clearly intended where the audience was a social media ad, right, or a post, right, months away, right, or in the lead up to the November election, right, really striking that strong contrast. You know, what's interesting is that kind of these gotcha moments have become increasingly common, mentioning kind of standing. Also on behalf of those in the chamber, right, the chance to heckle or stand up or show signs or other stuff. It draws a lot of attention. It's increasingly used by members and, of course, in this case, the president himself, to draw attention to that contrast, to try to make news, right, and have people talk about that and not necessarily the substance of the speech. So, in some sense, a lot of the attention was focused on creating that contrast, clearly with an eye for November, of doing things that paint the Democrats in a negative light and as a contrast to the many kind of positive things Trump highlighted.
There were many guests there last night, from Erica Kirk to the USA men's hockey team. Was there one that stood out for you?
I wouldn't say one. Awarding medals of honor during the speech itself, right, is kind of an interesting, right, change. We haven't really seen that. But the sheer number of guests, right, and the time devoted to them as well. So often, guests in the State of the Union are there to send a particular message in a very cursory, stand and acknowledge them or even point to them and mention them and the camera highlights them. But the many, many minutes devoted, right, of course, with the speech this long, you have the time to do it on these different guests to highlight various things. Some likened it a bit to an awards show in some sense rather than a speech. And, it is just an interesting change that we really haven't seen with previous presidents. And even in previous addresses, right, of Trump last year or in his first term, you really didn't see kind of that number of guests, right, and that attention paid to those in the chamber.
You've mentioned November a couple times. The impact of a speech like last night's on things like polling, whether the president says he looks at polling or he doesn't, and the midterms coming up. What do you think the impact will be?
So historically, State of the Unions don't matter. Except when they do, right? And they can,
well said.
With a few exceptions, but on average, if you look over the past half century, I think the average polling bump is like a net positive of 0.3% or something. It's often extremely small. It doesn't really necessarily change the dynamic, except when, right, a bunch of new information is revealed or the reaction to the speech is universally positive or negative. And I just don't think we saw any of that. His polling numbers are at a pretty historic low here, and particularly in the past few months. And many kind of set up this speech as a chance to really change things around with the months ahead. And I really don't see anything new revealed last night that would change people's minds about it of any party.
Stephen Goggin, Associate Professor of Political Science, San Diego State. We thank you as always. Good talking to you.
Thanks so much.